The Houston Texans are going to be one of the best teams in the entire NFL next year. And because this team has a rookie quarterback on such a cheap deal, this team has over $70 million in cap space to work with this offseason. So today, let's do our fantasy offseason for the Houston Texans. Now, when doing research on what people want the Houston Texans to do, I often run into different fan pages asking for them to go out there and get Chris Jones and Saquon Barkley. And as much as I would love to do that for this team, it's just not very realistic. So today, I'm going to do my best to give you guys a somewhat realistic fantasy version of what their offseason should look like. So with that being said, we're going to start off by doing a couple of subtractions on the roster to make a little bit more cap space for this offseason to work effectively. And those subtractions to the rosters are going to be by cutting Robert Woods and Jimmy Ward to gain us an additional $9 million. We are also going to be restructuring the contracts of Titus Howard, Laramie Tunsil, and Shaq Mason to help our cap space grow to an additional $23 million. And with those cuts of the two players and the restructuring of those three contracts, we have gained over $101 million in cap space in the offseason. With that being said, this team has a couple players that they should definitely look to re-sign. And with that being said, I have a total of 7 players who I expect the Houston Texans to be interested in bringing back. We will begin with Dalton Schultz, who in my opinion is a player that must come back on this team. I know that he seems to be a bit of a controversial figure within the Houston Texans fan base, but he is a very reliable weapon for CJ Stroud to throw the ball to. He's also very good in run blocking, and in totality, he's one of those very consistent tight ends that you want to have on your roster. So I'm going to look to bring him back on a 3-year deal worth $30 million in total. That puts him at about $10 million per year. Next up, I want to bring back Devin Singletary on a contract of 2 years, $11 million, and I'm going to give him $6 million in the first year so that next year it's a little bit cheaper. Devin Singletary is a very good change of pace back that I want this team to have moving forward. He grew a nice chemistry with the offensive line and with the quarterback, so I think that he is a pretty easy player to bring back. Also, he's not terribly expensive. Next up is my most expensive bring back player that I want this team to re-sign, and that is Jonathan Grenard. I'm going to bring him back on a 3-year deal worth about $42 million. That puts him for about $14 million per year. If you're going to have Will Anderson Jr. be that next level pass rusher on your team, he's going to need somebody to pass rush with him, and Jonathan Grenard is just one of those really good guys. He's never going to blow you away with 15 sacks in a season, but he's one of those guys who can get up to 10 sacks in a year, and I think he has a nice future with the Houston Texans. Next up, I want to bring back linebacker Blake Cashman on a 2-year deal worth about $9 million. I'm going to give him $4 million this year, and then next year we'll pay him however much he wants. Blake Cashman had a very good year this year, and I think moving forward, you need to have at least one linebacker come back. I'm not the biggest fan of Denzel Perryman, as he's a little bit older and a little bit slower and just not very good in pass coverage. Blake Cashman was able to pick up a lot of the slack in this linebacking room. Next up, we're going to bring back Sheldon Rankins on a 2-year deal worth about $20 million. That's going to put him at a contract of about $10 million per year. Last year, he had 6 sacks, and in totality, was very solid in run stuffs. He's one of those defensive tackles that it's hard to give him a ton of money, but it's also not easy to give him nothing, so you got to bring him back on a fairly good deal. Next up, we're going to bring back Derek Barnett on a 1-year deal worth about $6 million. Last year, he was very good on this Houston Texans team as a guy who could be a part of your rotational defensive lineman. He's just one of those guys who's just very solid. The numbers don't really pop out on you, but if you actually watch the tape, he had a very good year for the Houston Texans. Next up, we're going to bring back Kayami Fairbairn on a 2-year deal worth about $7 million. He's just a super accurate kicker who does a lot of really good things. So in totality, we spent about $53 million for this upcoming offseason, which leaves us with about $48 million in cap space to work in free agency. But one thing we do have to keep in mind is that we have to allocate at least $10 million to go to our upcoming rookie class. So that actually will bring us down to about $38 million in total. But now we get to more of the fun stuff, the more free agency, draft board type of stuff, the stuff where you get to bring this team up to that next level by having a good offseason. So you got to look at them in totality and look at what this team's problems are. I think the number one problem they have offensively is they really could use a new every down type of running back. They also could potentially use somebody in the receiving room. They also could potentially use a center or maybe a tackle on the offensive line. Defensively, we did not bring back Steven Nelson, so we're going to need to replace him in the cornerbacks room, and just in general, the secondary could use a lot of work as well. We're also going to need to add a few more pass rushes along the defensive line and potentially some new linebacker play as well. Well, fortunately for you guys, I was able to find some different players to fill in at different spots. Now again, I am not going to be somebody who's going to bring out Saquon Barkley and Chris Jones. It's just not very realistic, even though it could happen, and I would love to see that happen for the Texans. I actually think bringing in the group of guys I have here for about the same money as just 2 players makes more sense. So we're going to start off with the offense, and I actually only have 1 player in this free agency class who I think is a must-have in some sort of way. I'm not necessarily saying the player is a must-get, but I think the positional value has got to be there. So I decided to bring in KJ Osborne on a 2-year deal worth $14 million. He's going to be our new wide receiver 3 to go alongside Nico Collins and Tank Dell. I do find it a little bit weird that Texans fans are so pressed to go out there and draft a wide receiver in the first round. I can understand it, but Nico Collins is going to get a new contract next year, and Tank Dell has already proven to be a good wide receiver 2/even 1. You bring in KJ Osborne to be somebody who can get you 40 to 50 catches as that third option. I think it makes a ton of sense. One thing we also have to keep in mind is Brevin Jordan is just going to continue to get better in that tight end room, and he's going to eventually start to take over Dalton Schultz minutes. So you're going to have a ton of different weapons for CJ Stroud to work with. KJ Osborne would be somebody who could just be that extra guy to give you a little bit of extra stuff, who's also been around in this league for quite some time. And that is it for the offense, but now let's get to the defense. And I have a number of additions, starting off with Micah Hyde, the strong safety, on a one-year deal worth about $5 million. As we all know, Jalen Petrie is your starting free safety, but this team could, in my opinion, really use an upgrade in that strong safety room. They do have DeAndre Houston Carson, who I think is a decent strong safety, but I think bringing a guy like Micah Hyde, who's been around the league for many years, who may be looking at his last potential stop to try to win a championship. He's a veteran, he's been around for a while, he's very good in coverage, has been consistent throughout his entire career. Him joining Houston on a $5 million deal would be a home run pick in my opinion. To continue with the secondary room, I decided to bring in Chidobe Awuzie on a one-year deal worth about $8 to $9 million per year. He's going to be our replacement for Steven Nelson. When healthy, Chidobe Awuzie is one of the better corners in the entire NFL. He consistently puts up great stats, getting a lot of interceptions and just playing lockdown defense. Him and Derek Stingley are going to provide a top tier duo that's going to help continue to lock down in the secondary. That is not the only cornerback I want to bring in though. I also want to bring in Dane Jackson on a 2-year deal worth about $6 million. That puts him for $3 million per year. Dane Jackson is currently the Buffalo Bills starting cornerback, and I think he's going to provide a good rotational piece for the secondary room. Now, who's going to play the slot and who's going to play the outside? I'll leave that up to D'Amico Ryans. I personally think that you could probably move Chidobe or Dane Jackson into that slot and they'll play fine. But in totality, I think bringing in these two cornerbacks would help the secondary room out a ton. Next up, we need to look to bring in an extra pass rusher on this defensive line, so I went out there and got AJ Epinesa on a 2-year, $11 million deal. That'll put him for about $5.5 million per year. He's going to be that fourth option along the defensive line behind guys like Jonathan Grenard, Will Anderson, and Derek Barnett. He's somebody who I trust to at least get 6 to 7 sacks in a year, and I think with an upgraded role in Houston, he could potentially get up to 8 or 9 sacks. He's a good pass rusher, decent in run fits, and just a very solid defensive lineman in general. And bringing him in for a cheap deal of about $5.5 per year is definitely worth it. The last player who I have coming in free agency is going to be Azeez Al-Shaair, the linebacker who currently is playing for Tennessee but used to play for the San Francisco 49ers. I'm going to bring him on a deal of 3 years, $21 million. That puts him for about $7 million per year. He's going to be that Denzel Perriman replacement who's going to play alongside Blake Cashman and Christian Harris. Azeez Al-Shaair is basically a better version of what Denzel Perriman gets you. He's very good in run fits. He's better in coverage. Not to mention, Azeez's best year in the NFL was with the San Francisco 49ers, ironically with D'Amico Ryans as his defensive coordinator. He's going to fill in very nicely on this defense and play the exact same role he had with 49ers now with Houston. Bringing him in for only $7 million per year, in my opinion, is a very good and cheap deal. I would gladly do that in a heartbeat. But now we get to the part where it's a little bit harder to figure out exactly what they're going to do, because with a lot of the moves I've made, I've addressed a ton of their problems. So in the NFL draft, you can kind of go best available to continue to build upon different strengths of your roster. So I did about 3 mock drafts of the first 3 rounds for the Houston Texans. Super hard to figure out what players are actually going to be there for the Houston Texans. I did make my best judgment for who I would pick in that situation. So with my first pick at pick number 23, I went with Jackson Powers Johnson, the center out of Oregon. Now, this is the main guy who I have zero clue if he's going to be there at this pick. I actually kind of doubt he'll be here because I think he's either going to go to Miami or Dallas. But hypothetically, if he is here at pick 23, I think this would be a home run hit for them. Hypothetically, you'd have an offensive line of Laramie Tunsil at left tackle, Kenyon Green at left guard, Jackson Powers Johnson at center, Shaq Mason at right guard, and then Titus Howard back at right tackle with George Fant being your swinging tackle. Right then and there, you'd have a fantastic offensive line to surround CJ Stroud with. But if Jackson Powers Johnson is not there, I think a guy like Brian Thomas Jr. would also make a ton of sense to the Houston Texans. But for the sake of the video, we're just going to stick with Jackson Powers Johnson. Next up at pick number 59, I originally had them going with Braylon Trice, but as the draft went on more and more, I actually am starting to like Tavondre Sweat from Texas a little bit more. Now, if you don't know anything about Tavondre Sweat, he's big, he's nasty, he can stuff some runs, he's like a better version of Malik Collins, minus some pass rush upside. Now, I don't really know if this is a guy who's ever going to get you anything more than 5 sacks in a season, but he's probably going to be one of the most dominant run stuffers in the NFL. Think of him kind of like a Jordan Davis, but not as athletic. Hell, if he was a freak athlete like Jordan Davis, he would probably be a first-round pick, but I can still honestly see him being a first-round pick just because of how good he is at doing his job. He's big, he's strong, he's everything you want in a big, ugly defensive tackle. This is a Houston Texans team that last year wasn't necessarily bad at stuffing the run, but they also weren't great at it. T'Vondre Sweat would make this team fantastic in stuffing the run. With our last pick number 85, I decided to go with Trey Benson, the running back from Florida State. Now, if you don't know anything about this running back class, it's not a super dominant and fantastic running back class. Jonathan Brooks is probably your number one, but then outside of that, it's probably up to your own interpretation. Some people love Blake Corum, or some people like Jalen Wright. I love Trey Benson. I think that Trey Benson is probably the second or third best running back in this class. He proved himself at the draft combine and had a fantastic showing there. He's fast, he can move. He's one of those guys who I can see truly being a 3-down back. For our team, we already have Dameon Pierce and Devin Singletary. Singletary would already present that change of pace back who's going to be more of your pass catcher, but can also do some nice things in the running game, whereas Dameon Pierce will probably prove to be your third down and goal line back. Trey Benson could be the guy who fills in the holes of everybody else. He's going to be that probably your starter, with Devin Singletary being your number 2 and Dameon Pierce being your number 3, but you'd have a trio of running backs that can really do a lot of productive things. I wish I had a good example of this actually working within the NFL, but sort of think of it as you'd have Trey Benson come in on first down for your first down run, you'd have Devin Singletary come in on your second and third down plays, and if it's 3rd and 1, you're going to bring in Dameon Pierce. Dameon Pierce would probably gain a ton of touchdowns and a lot of production just off the fact that he's going to be your goal line or third down back who's just going to get those touchdowns over and over again. Trey Benson can be somebody who can fill in the holes of what those guys can't do. So in totality, we addressed a lot of the problems for the Houston Texans. Now, did this team get good enough to make it to a Super Bowl? I tend to think so. Yes, you didn't go out there and get a Saquon Barkley or a Chris Jones, but you got a bunch of really good NFL players who can do a lot of good things, especially when it matters most. Sometimes when you go out there and get these big name guys, you don't get the production you think you would out of them because they don't fit your system and you paid them a ton of money. Case in point, JC Jackson for the LA Chargers. And while I'm not saying that Chris Jones or Saquon wouldn't be fantastic fits for the Texans, I hope you guys get my point. If it's me, I'm not going to allocate $40 million to just those 2 players when I can allocate $40 million for the 6 players that I just got you guys. Not to mention in the draft, you can fill in any extra holes and hopefully get some guys who have the upside of a Chris Jones or a Saquon Barkley. So to my Houston Texans fans, do you guys agree with my fantasy offseason? If so, let me know in the comment section below. And if not, what moves would you guys make? And I better not hear nobody say Chris Jones and Saquon Barkley. I'm just kidding. Let me know. Love you guys. Peace.